Welcome to FlightGlobal Focus, your new essential podcast for trusted aviation insight. We publish new episodes twice weekly. Join us on Friday for a concise news briefing and on Monday for in-depth analysis covering airlines, defense, and aerospace. My name is Amber Elias, and joining me for this Airlines Focus episode is Airline Business Editor and FlightGlobal's Airlines Managing Editor, Lewis Harper.
Hi Amber, good to be here.
Lewis, this is a bit of a changer from the usual airlines episode format because we are here to talk about the 2024 Top 100 Airline Rankings by Airline Business. Everyone can make educated guesses about who the biggest airlines in the world are, but every year Airline Business actually publishes hard data against those assumptions. You recently pulled together and published the latest rankings of global airlines. Could you explain what the rankings are based on and how you pulled them together?
Thanks, Amber. Yes, so I've been working on Airline Business for around 9 years now, and every year, as you say, we produce a ranking of the top 100 global airlines by two metrics, the first being operating revenue and the other one being passenger traffic. So in the case of revenue, we use a dollar conversion from the local currency where needed to make sure we're comparing businesses from different regions as fairly as possible. For passenger traffic, we use the revenue passenger kilometre figure, or RPK as it is known. This is kind of the industry standard for measuring passenger traffic. So unlike the kind of basic passenger number figure, it takes distance flown into account. So it kind of has more meaning, gives a fuller picture of what's happening there. We take the full year and RPK figure as reported by the business. So the most recent ranking covers the 12 months ending 31st December 2024 for the majority of airlines. But there are obviously quite a few with a 31st of March 2025 year end and a handful with kind of a 30th of June 25 year end, Qantas and Air New Zealand being examples of that. And there are a couple of other outliers. So SAS and EasyJet like to keep everyone on their toes because they have years ending October and September respectively. So in those two cases, those would be the years ending 2024. In a small minority of cases, we have to make our own estimates. This may be because the airline does not publicly release data or that is late in doing so, for example. There's plenty of partial data we can get our hands on. So we might have a capacity figure for an airline, for example, that enables us to make a reasonable estimate of the traffic. But if you look at the article and the rankings, you'll see we do highlight the ones where we have done an estimate. In terms of sourcing that data, much of it already exists in the database that powers the Airline Business website, which we collect ourselves. There's also a fair amount of manual work done involved in pulling the ranking together as well. And we also look at metrics beyond the kind of headline revenue and RPK numbers. So that includes operating and net profits, passenger and cargo revenue, capacity measured in available seat kilometres, passenger numbers, and load factors. We provide percentage changes year on year and versus 2019, which was the last, obviously, full pre-COVID year. And I'll come back and talk a bit more about that metric later on. We do a top 100 list for both metrics, but obviously in order to do a top 100, you have to track dozens more airlines beyond the previous year's top 100 to ensure you capture those that move in and out of that ranking every year. So it's a huge task, takes quite some time, but it is enjoyable and always throws up some interesting narratives.
Now, the main thing that I think everybody wants to know, which is which airlines were ranked top by revenue in 2024.
Indeed. So the headlines for the revenue ranking would be, maybe unsurprisingly, the US carriers dominating at the top. So Delta Airlines, again, topped the ranking with an income of $61.6 billion. They were followed by United Airlines in second place and American Airlines in third. Interestingly, if you remove other revenue from the total and only include passenger and cargo revenue, United would have pipped Delta to the top spot, but we're looking at group results. So those other sources of income are incorporated into the figure we use for the ranking. So as I say, on revenue, you can see how much bigger the top US carrier groups are than their peers everywhere else, essentially. To put it in some context, the group in 10th place in the ranking, which is China Southern Airlines, has revenue that is less than half that achieved by any of Delta, United, or American. Beyond the top three, despite still lagging 2019 capacity and traffic, Lufthansa Group edged ahead of FedEx into fourth place FedEx saw stable revenue year on year because of freight market trends, which are obviously much below COVID era highs at the moment. Southwest was the only low-cost business in the top 10. Obviously, some of the businesses in the top 10 do have low-cost units, but it's not their primary business model. The next closest budget group was Ryanair, which sat in 18th place in the ranking this year. And while Chinese groups made big jumps in traffic ranking for 2024, and I'll talk about that in a bit, they were largely unmoved in the revenue ranking, reflecting some of the challenges they are having. So quickly, just to run through the top 10, Delta, followed by United, American, Lufthansa Group, FedEx, Emirates Group next, then BA and Iberia owner IAG, followed by Air France KLM Group, Southwest Airlines, and as I said, in 10th place, China Southern Airlines. And reflecting how much the industry has normalized, I think since a lot of the noise we saw during the COVID-19 crisis, the top 10 groups in 2024 by revenue were the same as those, but with some minor changes in position seen in 2023 and 2019.
In terms of profitability, though, does that show a similar trend?
Yeah, and there's some interest. One of the great things we can do with the data is aggregate it and look at the health of the industry as a whole. So while we don't do a top 100 by profitability, we do obviously follow those figures and include them in the tables. And in profit terms, figures covering 81 of the 100 biggest airline groups for whom an operating result is available show a profit of $67 billion in 2024, which fell just short of the $71 billion achieved by the same group in 2023. Reflecting the industry's small margins, it's noteworthy that the operating profit achieved by the top 100 airlines is only a few billion above the revenue achieved by one airline in the list, Delta at the top. Similarly, an aggregate net profit of $39 billion was just shy of the $42 billion achieved a year earlier. Both measures were way ahead of the results seen in 2019, although that period did include some COVID-19 impact for the airlines with a fiscal year ending in March 2020. The profitability in 2024 was on revenues that are powering towards the $1 trillion mark at $971 billion across the top 100 groups, which was up 8% on 2023. Higher costs and the end to some eye-wateringly high post-COVID yields seen in a capacity-constrained 2023 were among the factors driving the small fall in profitability for 24 despite higher revenues. European carriers in the top 100 continue to be the biggest drivers of airline profitability, accounting for 26% of the global operating profit and 35% of the net profit in 2024. As an aside, that slightly inconvenient narrative, given how keen European carriers are to protest the regulation and taxes they face and how that makes them uncompetitive on the global stage. In second place, in terms of the contribution to the global profit, are North American groups and Asia Pacific groups in third. In terms of the actual individual airlines, there's quite a familiar look to them in 2024. All but two of the top 10 groups by operating income were in the top 10 by revenue, and those two outliers are Turkish Airlines and Qantas Group, who are ranked 13th and 17th in the revenue rankings. So just to quickly run through the top 10 groups by operating profit, we've got Emirates Group top, Delta Airlines in second place, United third, IAG fourth, followed by Qatar Airways Group, American Airlines Group, Turkish Airlines, Lufthansa Group, Air France KLM Group, and Qantas Group in 10th place. And it's notable that Emirates tops both the operating and net profit rankings, and by some distance in the case of the latter. Its $5.57 billion net profit in 2024 was more than $2 billion ahead of the profits achieved by Delta and Turkish, respectively, in second and third place. The net profit figures expose the challenges being experienced by China's big groups as they seek to turn aggressive capacity growth into strong financials. So China Southern Airlines' tiny profit came as compatriots Air China and China Eastern were both loss-making in 2024. So those figures stand out in a sea of global peers who achieved profits of around $1 billion for the year. In contrast, there are two peers in Asia Pacific that significantly outperform their revenue rankings when it comes to net profit. So Singapore Airlines Group ranks 6th globally for net profit, but 20th for revenue. And Cathay Pacific Group ranked 10th for net profit, but 21st for revenue.
And Airline Business also does the rankings by traffic. Who is at the top of that list, and is it a familiar story as well?
Yeah, I'd love there to be more surprises in what I'm about to say, but given how far they're ahead on revenue, I guess it's no great surprise to see the big three US groups again firmly at the top of the list when it comes to revenue passenger kilometers. But this time there is some slight change in the order. So United Airlines is top, followed by American, and then Delta. United's lead in traffic terms is driven by its relatively big international presence, which obviously is a huge driver of RPKs versus domestic flying or local regional flying. And, while it serves tens of millions fewer passengers than its big rivals, and just to point out, almost 2 million fewer than Southwest, which is in 12th place in the RPK ranking, it leads the way in RPK terms. So to run through quickly the top 10. So as I said, United first, followed by American Airlines Group, Delta Airlines Group third, China Southern in fourth, then IAG, followed by Air China Group, Emirates, Air France KLM, Lufthansa Group, and Ryanair in 10th place. And as I said, China Southern Airlines Group and Air China Group now sit in 4th and 6th places, respectively, having made big jumps year on year. They've both been adding lots of international capacity, often to replace overseas carriers that were flying into China, and that explains why they've made big leaps there. And as I mentioned earlier, that has not necessarily translated into a big jump up the revenue rankings, however.
So again, in this case, we are seeing post-COVID normalization in the data.
Yeah, so when passenger traffic in the top 100 is split by region, for example, the proportions taken by each region's carriers almost exactly match those seen in 2019. So obviously during the COVID crisis, there were lots of predictions of this is going to change the industry forever. By many metrics, apart from lost growth, things have kind of reverted back to how they were. So the split regionally is Asia Pacific leading the way in 2024 with 33% of the traffic by RPK versus 34% in 2019. That's followed by Europe, 27% versus 27%. North America, a percentage point down on 24% versus 25% in 2019. Middle East up 1 percentage point at 10% versus 9%. Latin America flat 5 versus 5, and Africa on 1 versus 1. So in broad terms, nothing's changed since 2019 in terms of where the regions that are driving the traffic globally. And further demonstrating that calming trend. So year on year, passenger traffic growth across the top 100 groups was 11% in 2024. It had been at 32% in 2023 when there was much more COVID noise. For example, obviously in 2023, Chinese carriers had been barely doing any international flying the year before, but that came back really strongly in 2023. So there was still a lot of noise. There's still a little bit of noise, I think, in 2024's data, but it does put the aggregate figure much more closer to the passenger traffic growth rates we saw in the lead up to the pandemic, which were around 5 to 8% in the years preceding 2020. And actually looking at that growth rate, it kind of helps to put the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and its consequences into context. If we look at how things might have played out absent the pandemic, quite a stark fact is that 2024 was the first year since the pandemic in which passenger traffic exceeded 2019 levels. So bear in mind, this was an industry that was growing at kind of 5 to 8% before that. So to put some more colour on that, had passenger traffic measured in revenue passenger kilometres grown at the midpoint of the 5 to 8% range in 2020, rather than cratering amid global lockdowns, it would have been at or around the 8,424 billion RPKs achieved in 2024. So that shows you how much potential growth has been lost across 2020 to 2023. So absent the pandemic, RPKs might have comfortably exceeded 10,500 billion in 2024, based on a compound growth rate of around 6.5% from 2020 to 24. So it helps put it in context and shows that even though the industry did catch up across the top 100 airlines with 2019 traffic last year, in terms of catching up with previous growth trends, there's still a lot to do.
We've focused on the top end of the rankings so far and who is doing the most to get in those top 10s. But do the rankings also expose some negative trends in the industry?
Absolutely. And there's some familiar themes come up when you dig down into the data. So It's noteworthy that several carriers that have been particularly hard hit by aircraft groundings related to their Pratt & Whitney geared turbofans are among a small group in the top 100 who saw their RPKs fall year on year in 2024. They include Air New Zealand, JetBlue Airways, Spirit Airlines and Volaris, although clearly there were other factors in play at a couple of those operators. Several of the affected groups, when it comes to the GTF issues, also recorded lower revenues year on year, which is pretty significant for any business. So that includes Air New Zealand, JetBlue Airways, Spirit Airlines and Volaris again. And again, I'll just reiterate, there were obviously other factors at play there, particularly as we're seeing now in the case of Spirit. Another big trend that's exposed in the rankings is currency weakness, and that was felt very acutely in Brazil, where the Brazilian currency was very weak against the US dollar. And in the case of Azul and Gol, who have clearly been going through some challenges this year, they achieved revenue growth in their local currencies, but falls of 3% and 5% respectively when that revenue is converted to US dollars, showing why the cost environment for them, if they're paying for fuel or leases, whatever, in US dollars, has been particularly challenging. The biggest net losses for the year were seen at those Brazilian carriers because of those currency issues partly. So Azul's net loss topped 1.5 billion for the year. And that turned out obviously to be a keeper on its journey towards its recent Chapter 11 filing. As mentioned, Spirit, which obviously re-entered Chapter 11 for the second time in less than a year, saw its net loss top 1 billion, as did Air India Group. And that's partly, I think, driven by consolidation moves, bringing 2 airline units into the group and bringing in at the same time some of the weaker earnings among those. So I think you would expect that to improve. So in terms of other ways of looking at the data, broadly, I'd say 2024 was the year of the network carrier in financial terms. So we also obviously look at business model, and profits among the low-cost groups in the top 100 fell in 2024. So as a result, 89% of the overall operating profit among the top 100 groups was from network carrier groups, rising to 91% when net profit is considered. Low-cost group operating profits almost halved, meaning they contributed just 8% of the top 100 total, while their net profits were around 1/5 of those seen in 2023, accounting for just 3% of the top 100 total. And again, in traffic terms, low-cost carriers had been seeing pretty strong growth post-COVID, and it continues to be a feature of the ranking. So those airline groups are 16% above 2019 RPKs in 2024 versus 5% growth for network carriers in the list. But the network carrier groups grew more quickly year on year in 2024 at 12% versus 7% for low-cost carriers. And it's noteworthy that the low-cost RPK growth of 16% versus 2019 is outpaced by capacity growth of 17%. I think that reflects some of the overcapacity challenges seen in North America in particular, whereas network carrier groups have seen growth of 5% in RPKs on the same basis, but that is ahead of a 3% rise in capacity. And you would clearly, as a business leader, rather be there than where low-cost airlines are, where their capacity is outpacing the rise in demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the rankings have revealed so much so far broadly about, the industry and the state looking back. Previous years, obviously the last 5 years from COVID have had a massive impact on the industry. And it's so fascinating to sort of look at the pre-COVID numbers and see what parts of the industry are actually rebounding more strongly than others. Do the rankings reveal any other interesting trends that we should be aware of?
There are loads. And yeah, I would just, point people towards our coverage on the Airline Business website. As you mentioned, there are so many ways we can split the data. You could look at it obviously as a simple ranking of the airlines, but because we're able to aggregate so many different data points, it throws up so much and far too much to talk about here. So as I say, I would say have a look at the articles on our Airline Business website, and you can also see the full top 100 rankings there.
And listeners can find a discount code in the show notes for Airline Business and FlightGlobal. So do subscribe to see the full 2024 rankings and, of course, past years too. Moving on to this year, 2025, what are we seeing so far that might make a difference to the next rankings?
Yeah, the boring answer is we're seeing a lot of, obviously post-COVID normalization continued, as I touched on. We'll likely see revenue and traffic growth that are both in line with much more organic levels than those seen even in 2024, as I touched on earlier. I'd say at the moment, the top three carriers in both rankings, so Delta, United and American, are so far ahead in both cases that we are years away from anyone breaking into that group based on current assumptions of geopolitics and economics. Some themes will continue to weigh on the data, so we're still waiting for the Chinese majors to turn their fortunes around financially, for example. Not too many signs of that so far this year, but something to keep a watch out. And as I mentioned, carriers with the high exposure to Pratt & Whitney GTF engines of a particular age will continue to see that reflected in their data. We already heard plenty of airlines discussing that year. Some saying it's getting better, some saying it's the same, some saying it's getting worse, most saying it's still got a couple of years to run. Standing a bit further back, it'll be interesting to see how the Indian carriers make progress up the rankings. In both cases, so Indigo and Air India as the biggest operators there have been some challenges this year, whether it's the GTF issues at Indigo or the 787 crash at Air India, but they are still on the rise. You can also see growth markets making some noise in the data. For example, Saudi carriers achieved some significant growth figures in 2024 and will be doing the same this year. And you can expect some carriers, such as Uzbekistan Airways, from much smaller growth markets to make a bigger dent in this year's data. So I'm sure I've missed loads of things that we'll eventually look at in 2026 when we come to look at this year's data, but already plenty to look out for.
And of course, you and the airlines team continue to cover the industry in depth on FlightGlobal and Airline Business. There is so much that affects the airlines industry now. I mean, even COVID recovery, but airspace restrictions, traffic demand, and the growing US domestic and international market, obviously weighing heavily on the European competitors. Thank you, Lewis, for joining me on this Airlines Focus episode. It was great to chat.
Thanks, Amber.
FlightGlobal Focus is a production of FlightGlobal with audio editing by Lucy Johnson. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, or for commercial opportunities, please email podcast@flightglobal.com, and more information can be found in the show notes. Listeners can get a discount for a new subscription to Airline Business with the code ABPodcast and to FlightGlobal with the code FGPodcast. Terms and conditions apply. Listen, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.